The year is 905. We are not in a library or a palace, but on the banks of the Tigris River in Baghdad. The air is thick with the metallic tang of blood and the stench of the midday sun on a packed crowd. Forget everything you've been told about a golden age. The only gold here is the glint of sunlight on the guard's armor. There are no poets here, no scholars. There is only a coarse burlap sack writhing on the ground. The sound is what you notice first, not the jeers of the crowd, but a series of sickening, wet thuds. Two men, their muscles straining, lift and drop heavy wooden pestles again and again. This was the justice of the Caliph. This was the reality beneath the gleaming veneer of power. What could a man have possibly done to deserve a death like this? The answer is far more disturbing than you can imagine. And now please stop the video and subscribe to our channel. To be able to keep making videos like this, we need to reach 1,000 subscribers as soon as possible. Thank you. That gruesome, almost unbelievable scene on the riverbank. That was not the story the Abbasids told about themselves. Not even close. What you've just witnessed is the reality they tried to bury. To the outside world and to history, they built a very different image. An official narrative constructed from sandstone and ambition. Picture this. The 9th century. In the heart of their empire, they build the Great Mosque of Samarra. A statement of power so vast it almost seems like a geological feature. This wasn't just a place of worship, it was a declaration. Let's talk numbers, because the numbers here are insane. We have the original schematics, the archaeological surveys. The outer enclosure walls were nearly 9 feet thick. That's 2.65 meters of solid baked brick, fortified with 44 defensive towers. Think about that. Walls thick enough to stop an army, just to enclose a sacred space. The area inside those walls was a staggering 38,000 square meters. You could fit dozens of modern football fields inside and still have room to spare. And looming over it all, a structure that defied belief. The Malwiya Minaret. A spiraling cone of sandstone climbing 52 meters into the sky, that's 17 stories high, visible for miles across the flat Tigris Valley. It was a landmark, yes, but it was also a warning. A symbol of absolute dominance. This is the image they built for posterity. A civilization of impossible, breathtaking scale. But you have to ask yourself, why? Walls this thick aren't just for keeping people out. Sometimes, they're for keeping secrets in. And while those colossal structures were rising from the dust, a different kind of empire was being built within the walls of Baghdad. An empire not of brick and stone, but of ink and intellect. This is the part of the story you probably know. The legendary House of Wisdom, the Bayt al-Hikmah. It was a magnet for the greatest minds of the known world. A place where knowledge was more precious than gold. Here, a monumental translation movement was underway. Scholars, like the brilliant Nestorian Christian Hunayn ibn Ishaq, worked tirelessly, translating the entire corpus of Greek science and philosophy. Plato, Aristotle, Galen into Arabic, saving it from being lost to the darkness. You see, this intellectual furnace forged the modern world. It gave us advancements in medicine that were centuries ahead of Europe. Physicians like al-Razi were the first to clinically distinguish between smallpox and measles, a breakthrough that saved countless lives. They mapped the stars, invented algebra, and debated the very nature of existence. Every book was copied by hand, every theorem debated in the cool, shaded courtyards. It was a true golden age of the mind. But power is a jealous guardian. The same authority that funded the translators and celebrated the scientists also held the ultimate power of censorship. Knowledge was a tool, and a tool can be controlled. But what of the ideas that were never written down? What of the truths that were deliberately erased? We went looking for the records they tried to hide, the accounts that were buried beneath the official histories. And what we found reveals the terrifying price of all that progress. That celebrated house of wisdom, that beacon of intellectual light, existed in the shadow of something much older and far more powerful: absolute monarchy. The Caliph. the man who signed the checks. And while the scholars were translating Aristotle, the caliphs were indulging appetites that beggar belief. Forget the public works for a moment. Let's look at their private expenses, because newly analyzed records lay bare the sheer, breathtaking excess. The same caliph who built the Great Mosque, al-Mutawakkil, also embarked on a personal building spree of 20 new palaces. The cost, according to the caliph's own accountants, was somewhere between 258 and 294 million silver dirhams. It's a number so large it's almost meaningless. An expenditure of wealth that could fund entire nations, all for the comfort of one man and his court. These were not just homes, they were sprawling cities of pleasure, hidden behind high walls where the ruler's every whim was law. And behind the gilded facade of this immense wealth was a terrifying reality. Figures like the Caliph al-Mu'tadid became legendary not for their patronage of the arts, but for their cruelty. The official histories, if you read them carefully, speak of his inventive and deeply sadistic punishments, a dark creativity that stood in stark contrast to the intellectual flourishing happening just down the road. You see, this level of opulence is not sustained by scholarly debate. It is paid for with fear, and the currency of that fear was pain. So how do you maintain an empire of such extreme wealth and absolute power? How do you ensure that river of silver keeps flowing into your palaces without interruption? You don't start with the executioner's sword. That's too messy, too final. You start with something far more insidious: shame. You start in the marketplace, in the bright light of day. You take a man, a perjurer, a dissident, a merchant who cheated his customers, and you make him into a spectacle of ruin. His face blackened with soot, a mark of disgrace for all to see. You put him backwards on a donkey and parade him through the jeering crowds as they hurl insults and refuse. This wasn't random mob justice. This had a name. It was a formal, legal tool of the state called tashhir, a meticulously orchestrated act of public humiliation designed to surgically remove a person's dignity, to sever them from their community. It was theater, a brutal piece of street performance with a very clear message: obey, conform, disappear into the crowd, or this will be you. It was a warning, a public spectacle designed to enforce conformity. But for those who did not heed the warning, it gets much, much worse. The caliph's power was absolute, but the world was large, and while he could orchestrate the humiliation of a single man in a Baghdad market, his control frayed at the edges of his empire. Out there, in the vast wildernesses, other powers held sway, with customs and rituals that would make a courtier's blood run cold. And we only know about it because one of those courtiers was sent to see it for himself, and he wrote everything down. His name was Ibn Fadlan. He was a diplomat, a man of letters, steeped in the sophisticated pious world of the Abbasid court. In the year 921, he was dispatched by the Caliph on a delicate mission to the far north. His account, his risala, was never meant to be a celebrated history. It was a field report, a raw and often horrified intelligence briefing for his masters in Baghdad. And in it, he describes his encounter with a group of Turkic traders known as the Rus. He is utterly appalled by them. In his own words, he calls them the filthiest of God's creatures, describing their lack of hygiene, their public rituals, and what he saw as their shockingly free sexual morals. To this refined man from the center of civilization, they were savages. He was a man documenting a nightmare, and he had only just arrived. The worst was yet to come. Ibn Fadlan's initial disgust at their hygiene was nothing. He was about to become a formal witness to a ceremony so alien and so brutal, it would redefine his understanding of the world. A chieftain of the Rus had died, and as they prepared his ship on the riverbank, turning it into a funeral pyre, Ibn Fadlan was told that one of the man's slave girls had volunteered to join him in the afterlife. What did volunteer even mean in this context? He watched her for days. She was given the finest clothes, attended to constantly, and plied with strong drink. He describes her singing and seeming cheerful, a state of ritual intoxication that hangs over his entire account with a sickening dread. The day of the funeral arrived. The air was thick with the sound of chanting and the smell of alcohol. They led the girl to the ship where a tent had been erected. She was given a final drink, she sang her final songs, and then she was guided inside. An old woman, a terrifying figure they called the Angel of Death, followed her in. The girl's male relatives stood outside, beating their shields with sticks. A signal. Inside the tent, 2 men slipped a rope around her neck. As they pulled it tight, the Angel of Death drew a broad-bladed dagger and began stabbing the girl repeatedly between the ribs. The rhythmic, brutal thudding of the shields outside was meant to drown out her screams. Then, they set the ship ablaze. A human pyre pushed out into the current. Ibn Fadlan recorded every detail. A diplomat forced to witness a nightmare. Can you imagine writing that report for the Caliph, knowing this was the world just beyond your gilded borders? That ritual on the Volga River was the work of what Ibn Fadlan considered barbarians. But the horrifying truth is that the violence inside the Caliph's civilized capital was often far more methodical, more bureaucratic, and infinitely more cruel. While outsiders practiced ritual sacrifice, the Abbasid state was perfecting the art of execution as a tool of terror. For the most severe crimes against the state, they brought out the elephants. Imagine the spectacle. A condemned man, bound and helpless on the ground in a public square. The deliberate, earth-shaking tread of the animal. The mahout's quiet command. This wasn't a quick death. It was a demonstration of weight, of crushing, absolute power, designed to pulverize a human body into an unrecognizable pulp for the largest possible audience. But even that wasn't the most calculated cruelty. Remember the man in the sack from the beginning? That sound of the pestles on the riverbank? We dug into the court records to find out what he did. Was it murder? Treason? No. According to the Chronicle of Miskawayh, his crime was a form of religious heresy, an ideological challenge to the Caliph's authority. And for that, the state prescribed a special death. The procedure was documented with chilling clarity. He was placed in the burlap sack to contain the mess. 2 executioners then used heavy wooden pestles, the kind used for grinding grain, to systematically break his bones and pulp his body. The sack muffled the screams, turning them into sickening, wet thuds. And when the thudding finally stopped, they simply threw it all into the Tigris River, an execution and a garbage disposal in one efficient, state-sanctioned act. These aren't fables. These accounts are detailed in the administrative and historical chronicles of the time. This was the justice of the Caliphs, a system of terror designed to be seen and heard. But for every story written by the state, there are thousands whispered by its victims. And sometimes, those whispers survive. Those state-sanctioned chronicles of caliphs and executions, that's the history they wanted us to read. But for 1,000 years, a different archive was gathering dust, hidden away in the walls of a synagogue in Old Cairo. An archive of whispers. It's called the Cairo Geniza, a storeroom, a dumping ground for any piece of paper with God's name written on it. And because of that religious custom, hundreds of thousands of documents were saved by accident, recently discovered, painstakingly pieced together. They form an unfiltered, secret history of life under the Caliphs. And it's not a story of golden ages or grand architecture. It's a story told through faded ink on scraps of parchment. Here, you won't find the decrees of Caliphs. You'll find a widow's desperate appeal to a community court for her meager inheritance. You'll find a merchant's frantic letter about a shipment seized by a corrupt official. You'll find marriage contracts, debt lists, private pleas, and bitter complaints. It's the raw data of human existence, completely contradicting the polished narrative of a just and prosperous empire. For every official chronicle describing the Caliph's generosity, the Geniza holds a dozen records of crushing taxes and desperate people on the brink of ruin. It reveals the vast, sprawling gap between the law and the reality. History is written by the powerful, but sometimes the victims leave receipts, and these fragile, forgotten pieces of paper are the receipts for an entire golden age. Receipts that force us to ask one final, disturbing question. So, What does a golden age truly mean if the people living in it are leaving behind records of such quiet desperation? What is the value of a breakthrough in medicine if the state has perfected a dozen ways to surgically dismantle a human body? We are left with a profound and deeply uncomfortable truth: the towering minarets and the public executions, the brilliant scholars and the terrified victims, the opulent palaces and the desperate letters pleading for justice. These are not contradictions. They are two sides of the exact same coin. They are the inseparable products of absolute, unchecked power. The same vast treasury that funded the translation of Plato also paid the executioner who wielded the pestle. The same authority that built hospitals also used humiliation as a weapon of state terror. The splendor and the horror were not in opposition. One was the price of the other. We look back and marvel at the achievements, at the art and the science, and we call it a golden age. But the records are clear. The gold was always stained with blood. The question we must ask ourselves is, what bloodstains are we ignoring in our own histories?